Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people
I'm Chef AJ.
like
Today
you
is Mark.
who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Before I introduce today's special guest, I want to thank everyone who ordered my brand new book, the 10th anniversary edition of Unprocessed, with 30 brand new recipes, a brand new foreword by Dr. John McDougall, wonderful color photos by Hannah Kaminsky, and updated recipes in case you want to limit or lower the amount of fat in your diet. We gave options this time. And if you buy it, or if you already bought it by Sunday, April 3rd, midnight Pacific time in the year 2022, we'd love to send you almost $100 worth of bonuses simply by sending us your receipt or a screenshot of your receipt to chefajbonus@yahoo.com. And we'll send you 3 exclusive 2-hour video cooking classes that I charge $25 each for, with a PDF of the recipes and the audio files of the book, which when it's on Audible, won't be free. So there you have it. Thank you so much for your support. So today we have Eileen. God, I practiced her name with her. I don't know why I get so tripped up. Kopsaftis. Boy, that's a mouthful.
Beautiful. My husband would be proud of you. Yes.
And she is not only plant-based and awesome, she's been on the plan before, on the show before. I cannot talk. See, your name makes it so hard for me to talk.
All my students, when I taught anatomy and physiology, called me Mrs. K.
That's what I'm going to call you, Mrs. K. But today she's going to be talking about 3 common pain culprits and how to find them. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat and I will ask them to her. Please welcome back Eileen, Mrs. K. Much easier.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, AJ. I'm thrilled to be here. I know the last time that I was here, I kind of checked just to see, and it's like 17,000 views. So I guess it was a popular title, which was How Food Impacts Arthritis and Chronic Pain. And I had a PowerPoint slide and I did a big presentation with lots of data. This time I'm completely switching gears. And I'm going to teach something that I could not be more passionate about. Of course, what we put in our mouth affects everything. So that's like primary, right? This is kind of secondary, but I think it's about the same power as far as how we move. If we have pain, if we're declining as we age, which is not, it's not a rite of passage to end up needing disposable underwear before we go below ground. It's really not. And so today I'm going to talk about 3 common pain culprits and how to find them. And I thought, I know we only have about an hour, so there's only so much I can share in an hour, but I'm going to try to really power pack this so people get a lot out of it. I'm going to cover an introduction to authentic human movement, which I talk about in pretty good detail in my book, Pain Culprits. And so if anybody's interested in that, I'm going to talk about 3 things there. And then I'm going to cover the 3 common areas that can lead to pain pretty much anywhere in the body, how to assess those areas, and I'm going to show an introduction to how to train them authentically. So I'm going to actually show some movements that people can try. So hopefully I won't get off track. I got a little outline to keep me on task and I don't get off on a tangent on things. So first I'm going to talk about authentic human movement and what that means. And, everybody knows what authentic means, right? But a lot of us have learned things that are not don't know things that are not mainstream, but should be. So a lot of us have been trained by well-meaning, but kind of misinformed people when it comes to exercise, movement, how to rehabilitate things. Even my own profession. I mean, I've been a PT now for almost 27 years. And even my own profession, there are those who lack knowledge as far as how the body really functions. It's like they're isolating everything. So first I want to introduce something called 3-plane motion. And the reason that we don't look like robots, unless you're watching So You Think You Can Dance, Fiction was my favorite person on that show, and he did win that year, and he could move like so robotic, it was amazing. And so we don't look like robots when we move, because we move in 3 planes of motion for every movement that we make. We're moving forward and back, which is sagittal plane, and nobody has to remember the names, but just know the movements, right? So we move forward and back, we move side to side, and we move in rotation, right? That's 3-plane function. Well, every movement we make includes all 3 planes of motion, which is why we look like human beings when we move. And we don't look like a robot because we're moving in 1 plane at a time, right? So it's really important that we train our bodies in 3-plane motion. because that's how we move. And so oftentimes when we do exercises, we're only doing one plane of motion. For instance, if somebody goes to do a bicep curl, you know, they've got the weight in their hand and they come up. Let me grab a weight here and I'll show you. So this will just give people a good idea. So a lot of the times we train, right? We just do this. This is a bicep curl. We keep our elbow locked to our side and we just pull the weight up and down. That's sagittal plane. Well, our bicep can also move in transverse plane. And so a lot of the times people will kind of supinate as they come up. They know that. They go into pronation, supination, right? So they're kind of rotating their forearm because they're going to get a little more blast there. But ideally, because our body moves in 3 planes of motion all the time, we don't want to isolate muscles and do repetitive motions in 1 plane of motion and not allow the rest of the body to be part of the team. Because when we do that, that's when we end up with inflammation, tendonitis, bursitis, all the itises, all the inflammation, which can also be foodborne. But if it's movement, right, we're doing a motion that's not really authentic, but we think we need to train that muscle and get that muscle stronger, we can literally do more harm than good. And a lot of people don't know this. And this is why I see a lot of people in the clinic who spend a lot of time in the gym because they're doing things that are not authentic human movement. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. The next thing I want to talk about is everything is connected to everything else. And I want to share my favorite story, and I'll try to be brief, but this is my favorite story explaining how one part of the body can be so far away from another part and still impact it in a bad way. So this guy was on my schedule. He had been seen by another PT, and this was many years ago, back when everybody got scheduled 3 times a week for 4 weeks, no matter what their problem was, right? So this man had already received about 9 sessions with a therapist who went on vacation. So he got on my schedule. So I'm looking at his chart. He was there for neck pain. And I looked at the details and no progress had been made. So I asked him, I said, when do you get your neck pain? And he told me he got it in the mornings when he was doing his morning walk. It was his favorite exercise. He didn't want to give it up, but by the end of his walk, he had neck pain and a headache. So I said, okay, well, because of my training, and I know how everything's connected to everything else, I said, well, maybe there's something going on with your low back. Do you mind if I look? He was okay with that. He wanted to get better. So I looked at his low back, made a small correction there, but I really didn't think that was it. So I asked him, how are your ankles? Have you ever sprained your ankles? And he said, oh, I sprained them so many times I lost count in college when I was performing sports. So I looked at his ankles and there's something called dorsiflexion, and I'll demonstrate that. So when your toes come up toward your shin, that's dorsiflexion. And when we walk, we need dorsiflexion very much. And when I start talking about the 3 common culprit areas, I'm going to teach a lot more on that. But getting back to his story, he didn't have any dorsiflexion on either foot. Normal's about 20 to 30 degrees. He was at 0 on one side, and I think he was like a -5 on the other. He was kind of stuck in plantar flexion the opposite way, which meant he was walking flat-footed, which was creating this abnormal stress up the back line of the body. So I mobilized his ankles, restored dorsiflexion, taught him a really good stretch because the calf muscles weren't used to getting longer for a long time. And he was completely cured. He had no more neck pain and headaches. But imagine if we just kept treating his neck, right? Because we see people as a body part when they walk through the door. Oh, you're a shoulder, you're a knee, you're a hip, you're a neck. But we're a whole person. We don't take body parts off and put them on the shelf when we go to bed, right? Everything's connected. And so in my book, I've got 4 different chapters on different body parts: the hip, the shoulder, the knee, and the back. And it explains how they can impact other areas and other areas can impact them. So they'll go into more detail there for anybody who's interested. But just understand, I could have kept treating this man's neck. I think he was getting ultrasound and hot pack and maybe some range of motion stuff, but he would have never got better if we didn't look at him as a whole person. So it's really important. Everything's connected to everything else, and we need to know that, right?
That's true for everything, though. The environment, the animals, our health. I mean, that what you just said, that everything is connected to everything else. That's like Chief Seattle. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the strand, he does to himself.
Yes, yes, I love that. And T. Colin Campbell in his book Whole talks about reductionism when it comes to nutrition, right? Well, we've got reductionism when it comes to pain treatments and when it comes to health and when it comes to everything in the medical world is reductionism. And it lacks a lot of positive result because of that.
Angela would like to know, can you see people virtually? And if so, are there any limitations on where they live?
Oh, that's a really good question. I've been working with people using Zoom for years, long before the world shut down, because I teach methods that empowers the person how to address themselves. I can walk them through a 3-plane assessment and figure out what major parts of the body are not working well, and then teach them how to train those. Yeah, good question.
Great. I'm sure you've given me your website and we'll link to it if you haven't.
Yes, I think I did, hopefully. All right. The last thing I want to talk about as far as authentic human movement, and then move into the 3 common areas, is muscles work subconsciously in response to motion. So a lot of times people think that, their muscles are what accomplish everything. Well, they do. But when we first initiate movement, we're contracting a muscle. But then once we get moving, it's a physics thing. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. Muscles are controlling the motion. And how they control the motion is they get longer. They do what's called an eccentric contraction. The muscle can get shorter, which is concentric, or it can get longer under tension. If I was holding a weight, right now my bicep is lowering that weight with control. So it's now getting longer under tension. That's an eccentric contraction. And so typically, how our muscles are designed for us to have function, daily function, and do everything without pain, they need to be able to get longer and control the movement. And so I'm going to show that when I talk about the 3 common areas. But so often, again, in the gym, we're shortening muscles, right? Training them that way. But if their job is to get longer and control movement, we're kind of missing something when we train ourselves, right? And so we need to make sure muscles can do that. And a lot of the times, and when I get talk about one of the areas, because we sit so much, a lot of muscles lose the ability to eccentrically control our position, our posture, our movement. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself here because I've got a stated task. There's so many things I want to share, but I don't want people to feel like they've been fire hosed either. I want them to understand some of this stuff. So the 3 common areas that can lead to pain, and pretty much anywhere, ankles and neck, right? I also want to show how to assess those areas and an introduction to training them authentically. So the first area that is one of the most common areas that people have no clue can impact the whole body is the ankle, the foot and ankle. Now, I already talked about how it can affect the neck, but it can also affect shoulders. Even if you're young and healthy and fit. I had a young man come in, he was a football quarterback for the local college, and his diagnosis was shoulder tendonitis. And as quarterbacks do, they have 3-hour trainings where they do what's called a 3-man throw, and they're just constantly throwing the football. He couldn't finish his 3-hour training because he would have pain in his shoulder and his elbow. I believe it was a dual diagnosis of shoulder and elbow tendonitis. So I assessed this young man. His shoulder was fine. His elbow was fine. I found nothing wrong. No range of motion limitations, no strength limitations. And this young man was like, he didn't have an ounce of fat on his body. He was muscle from head to toe. He was so fit and so strong. So I asked him to show me how he threw a football. So he threw the football, and I saw how unstable his ankle was. And I asked him, do you ever sprain your ankles? He said he rolls out on them in practice and has to walk off the pain half the time. So talk about unstable ankles. So let me explain how that can happen. So when you go to throw something, and my camera, there we go, it took my camera a minute to figure out where I was. So when you go to throw something, right, you're gonna have a foot forward and you're gonna throw. Now, when I go to release the ball, that's when my shoulder can stop moving forward. But if my ankle is unstable and my arm reaches out, the ankle's not going to stop and control the motion, and it's going to allow me to go further than I should. So now my shoulder keeps going beyond what's optimal for releasing the ball and not aggravating or irritating any of the structures. So when this young man was doing this and the instability in the ankle allowed his shoulder to go more than it should go. And so every time he released the ball, he was creating irritation, which would lead to some inflammation. And within time, he had pain in his shoulder. So I never touched his shoulder. We did 4 sessions where I taught him how to stabilize the ankles, and he could throw for hours completely pain-free. And I never touched his shoulder. So the ankle is so important when everything happens from the ground up. And I know we're limited in time, so I'm going to try to teach a few really important basics about the foot and ankle. So what happens is when I go to just take a step, when I just walk, and I did a couple of videos on this. I started doing some movement education on my YouTube channel, so people can check this out in more detail. But when I go to take a step, my heel bone has to do a certain movement. It's called eversion. And when that happens, there's a joint on top of that bone that rolls down and in and allows my foot to be nice and flexible and absorb shock. So now I'm not jarring my body every time my foot hits the ground. And it's flexible, which means if I'm on an unstable surface, it knows how to handle that without me losing my balance. So it's a very important thing that has to happen. And when all of that happens, that triggers my shin bone to rotate in slightly, my thigh bone to rotate in slightly. And when that happens, those muscles that are designed to respond to movement subconsciously, like I said earlier, get longer. They eccentrically lengthen under tension, and they control my movement so that things are happening the way they're designed to happen when I walk. So now, when I come forward onto that foot, just as I go to lift this foot up, now that heel bone has to do something called inversion, which creates that joint on top of it, which is the subtalar joint, to rotate up and out. And now what that does is that locks my foot so that it's a nice, stable surface. So when I pick this foot up, I'm not going to lose my balance. I'm going to stay nice and secure and stable until this foot hits the ground and everything starts all over again. Now, when that happens, now that bone, the shin bone, turns out a little, the thigh bone turns out a little, and completely different muscles are loading eccentrically to control the motion. So as you can see, if that foot and ankle is not functioning properly, every step you take is going to force your body to compensate in some way. Muscles that aren't designed to do a motion, or the muscles that are designed to do it aren't able to do it properly, you're going to end up with stress and strain pretty much anywhere in the body, which is why if the foot and ankle doesn't work right, you can have a lot of knee problems. And when I talk about the next area, I'll mention what can happen with the knee. But the knee, it's just a simple hinge joint. It just bends one way, kind of like a door, right? Now, there is a little bit of complexity to it, but it's one of the simplest joints in the body. It's kind of stuck between the ankle and the next place I'm going to talk about, the hip. And so it's got no place to go. If the foot and ankle's not working right, which is a very complex joint, and the hip isn't working right, which is the second most mobile joint in the body, with the shoulder being the most mobile, right? You can't quite do that with the hip unless you're in the circus. But my point is, those two, the hips and the ankles, really can impact knee function. And so many people have knee pain, and all they're doing is treating the knee, that reductionism, right? We're going to inject it, and we're going to surgically alter it, and we're going to heat it, and we're going to ice it, and we're going to do all these things to the knee. And for those who may have seen the other time that I was here on your show, I talked about all the things that we do to the knee that really aren't effective, right? And it's one of the reasons why, because we need to be training and making sure the hips and the ankles are working properly. So let me talk about the hip for a minute. So your hips, you've got lots of movement that happens at the hip. And I'll explain what happens when you walk. This is the simplest way to share things. So when I go to take a step, as I said, that all happens from the ankle, right? Rotates those bones in a certain way. So when I land on my heel, those bones are rotating in slightly. which is triggering the muscles in the back of the hip to get longer and control the motion. Now, remember three-plane motion, forward and back, side to side, and turning. The hips load in all three planes when we walk. A lot of people would think, well, it's just forward and back, right? This leg went forward, this leg went back. But no, there's that side to side motion that happens in the hips. When I go to step on this foot, if I'm not stable and this hip doesn't load well, guess what happens? I limp, right? How many people have you seen? They limp every time they step on that leg. It's because the hip's not functioning properly in the frontal plane, which is side to side motion. So your hips have to load to keep your pelvis stable and level when you walk. We also have the rotation that happens in the hip. And as I said, it starts at the ankle. This bone turns in, this bone turns in. When I land on my heel, there's a rotation that happens. When I go to come forward, I'm rotating. My trunk kind of goes this way, but my pelvis and my hips go that way. And that has to happen as well with good control. The muscles have to be able to perform in all three planes of motion with both mobility and stability. Or you're going to have things compensating. It's going to lead to pain and problems. I had a guy once who couldn't bend over and pick up his dog, and he had pain here in the front of his shoulder. And when I assessed him, there wasn't anything wrong with his shoulder. But guess what? He wasn't stable here. So I taught him a couple of motions to get those muscles working again, and he could pick up his dog all day with no pain in that shoulder. But his hip wasn't working right. So we've got to look at ourselves as a whole body, not a body part. Okay. All right. The third area that I want to cover is the trunk between the neck and the lumbar spine. It's called the thoracic spine. It's where all our ribs attach. There's 12 vertebrae and 12 ribs. The trunk is so important to have full motion. The trunk it's kind of like Ginsu knives. It does it all, right? It'll bend forward, it'll bend backward, it'll go sideways, and it'll rotate. And it's really important. And a lot of people, and this is huge as we get older. A lot of people lose function in their thoracic spine as they age, and they don't understand why. Now when they turn their neck, it hurts, or their low back hurts whenever they turn, or they can't even back up their car in their driveway because they can't turn enough to see that. And that's almost always trunk. It's usually not the neck and the low back. Your low back, your lumbar spine is actually designed to move forward and back really well. It doesn't have a lot of motion side to side or turning. So the low back depends on the hips and the trunk to be turning well. So, and a lot of the times I'll kind of joke and tell people you can sort of ignore the low back to fix it because you've got to address the hips and the trunk. So getting back to the trunk, we want that trunk to have full mobility in all three planes of motion. And there are ways to train it that will allow it to do that. But very often, as I said, if you have pain when you turn your neck, it's probably your trunk. Your trunk is probably not rotating fully both ways. And sometimes we'll have, and you can just assess yourself and see, if you just turn to the right and you turn to the left, is there a difference? Do you feel any pain, any symptoms, any pulling going one way versus the other? Or do you notice you can go a lot further one way than the other? That's an asymmetry or an imbalance. And that means every move you make throughout the day, your body has to compensate because there's an impairment or a lack in a motion that really needs to be there so that everything moves authentically. All right, so that's the three common pain culprits and how they can impact the body. And again, I know we're kind of limited on time, so I can't go into too much detail. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to teach how to assess these three areas and then how to train them. So when you go to assess the ankle, you do want to assess it in all three planes of motion. So I actually have a video that teaches how to assess your body in 3 planes of motion. And there's even a PDF that you can download and document your findings. And that's all free on one of my websites. And I think I sent you that information, but if people go to my website, they'll find everything. So how we check the foot and ankle and make sure it's working in all 3 planes, the simplest way is to come forward. So if I go to step forward, ideally, I can keep my heel down and my knee stays straight. And that's dorsiflexion. But it's important that it's weight-bearing dorsiflexion. A lot of the times people will check, they'll be laying down on a table to be assessed, and the therapist will just bend their ankle and see how much motion do they have. Well, it doesn't really matter how much motion you have in your ankle when you're not weight-bearing. It matters how much motion you have when you are weight-bearing, because that's when we need it to happen most. And so I'm just going to step forward, and can you keep the heel down? That's sagittal plane assessment, right? Now, we also want that ankle to be dorsiflexing, right? Toes closer to the shin in the other planes of motion, because when we walk, that's when it has to happen. So if I come forward and I sort of do a little bit of a side-to-side motion, how does that feel in that foot and ankle? Is it moving? I can also kind of go sideways here and sideways here. Is that foot and ankle? And you can kind of see as I go this way, my shin is coming this way, but my heel's staying on the floor. If I go this way, it's the opposite. So I've got pretty good range in that ankle in the frontal plane. It'll go side to side. Now we also have turning. So if you want to turn, and you might want to hold on to something when you do this if you've got any stability issues. But if I turn all the way this way, you can see now my weight is going to go on the outside of my foot, and there's no pain. I've got full motion. And if I turn all the way this way, the weight goes on the inside of my foot, and that's moving as well. So if you're not feeling that come up and do all of these funky things, then you've got pretty good mobility in the foot and ankle. If you don't, I'm going to show you an exercise now so that you can work on it. Now, obviously, I don't know what's going on with anyone who's watching this, so I don't want anybody to do anything they know they should not do, right? A lot of the times, I think we all tend to have really good instincts, but sometimes we ignore them. I've had a lot of people come into the clinic who were in a yoga class, and they did something in the yoga class that they knew they shouldn't do, but they didn't want to stand out amidst all the other people in the class and get attention. So they did it anyway, and then they end up coming in because they hurt themselves. So I don't want anybody to do anything they know they shouldn't do. So usually I'll teach people to do this up against the wall, right? But I'm going to show you this way so you can see what my foot and ankle is doing here. I would have done this down in the gym, but I wasn't sure how good my Zoom would work down there. So what you're going to do is you're going to do what I showed for the test. You're going to come forward. Now you need to make sure your knee is nice and straight and that your toe is pointed forward. If your toe points out like that, you're lacking dorsiflexion. Your body's trying to cheat, right? Your brain just knows what you want to do, and it tells the body how to do it based on what it can do. Your brain isn't going to tell you, guess what, we have to cheat because we don't have dorsiflexion, so we're going to turn out. So you've got to pay attention to what you're doing. So toe is forward, heel stays down, knee stays nice and straight. Now, if that heel wants to come up, then what you need to do is bring your foot closer because you don't have as much range. But you want it back as far as it can go comfortably. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift my hips forward. And as you can see, my leg is moving closer toward my toes, but my heel is not coming up, right? And that's dorsiflexion. But we want to dynamically load the muscle. Remember that eccentric load. When we walk, we don't take a step and wait 30 seconds before we take the next step, right? So we want that muscle to learn how to load and unload, but comfortable. We're not, on our way to a fire. We're not rushing, but you do want to move in and out of the motion. So that's going to help with dorsiflexion. Now we want to do the side-to-side motion training. So how we do that is you come forward first to load it, and then you can kind of pretend you got parallel bars here, and you want to just go side to side with your hips. So I'll show you from the front so you can see what my hips are doing. So it's just a side-to-side motion. like that. And that's going to work how that heel bone has to invert and evert. It has to go in and out for that beautiful, from the ground up reaction to happen in the body. So you need to make sure that you're coming forward to load it first, then you go side to side with the hips. Okay. The last one is the rotation. Now, usually, you can come back and give it just a little break before you do the next movement. We're going to rotate, but we have to come forward and load it again. Make sure the toes are forward, heel is down, come forward to load it, and then you're going to rotate your pelvis. This is going to give you the beautiful pronation, supination, and all the wonderful things that foot and ankle has to do. Now, what I tell people usually is kind of pretend you got a flashlight in your belly button and you're just shining the light back and forth across the room. That's going to help you to do the pelvis. And you can turn your whole body, right? You're not trying to just twist your hips. And I don't want anybody to hurt their back or anything. So just turn the whole body, right and left. Now, there's a caveat to this. If any of those motions are painful, if you notice that you've got pain maybe in the low back, a hip, a knee, a shoulder, anywhere, don't do that motion. Do the motions that you can do that don't elicit pain. So an example would be, if I'm going to do the side to side, and maybe if my hips go this way, that's not comfortable, then just do this way and straight. The human body has this amazing ability. Usually after just a few days, you'll notice that you can do both directions. So usually it'll restore what it can't do. The same thing with rotation. If one of those motions is not happy, don't do that motion, do the one that makes it happy. And it helps to restore the body in that plane, both directions, usually, unless there's some kind of a structural issue. But I've been, I can't tell you how many times I've had a patient come into the clinic and they couldn't do one way. And I said, well, just do the way you can. The next visit, just a few days later, they'll say, oh yeah, I can go both ways now, no problem. It's shocking how often that happens. So that's important to know. Okay, so that's the ankle. Hips. How do you assess the hips? The hips, you want to make sure that the front of the hip is working well, the back of the hip is working well, the outside and the inside of the hip is working well, because you need all three planes of motion. And so assessing the hip, again, as I said, I've got that video that walks you through 6 motions that assess everything from head to toe. But if we just want to look at the hip, we want to make sure that all areas of the hip are working right. So when I come forward, that's assessing the front of the hip, right? And you can go in and out of that motion. Now you'll see this is kind of similar to the ankle that we're testing, right? And if you can't keep the heel down, that's okay. If you really want to test the hip, if the heel comes up a little, that's all right. What we're doing here is we're seeing is the front of that hip opening up. Will it lengthen with control? And this is huge. This is when you get older and you're like this, because that hip muscle in the front has gotten so weak that it can't even let you stand up straight, because if you do, you're going to fall back and smack your head open. So this is why a lot of people, especially if they have instability, they're forward because they don't want to fall backward, because these muscles that stabilize you can no longer stabilize you. They've gotten weak, or they've shortened, or both. And what are we doing most of our lives now? We're sitting. Those muscles are getting short, right? And if that muscle's meant to stabilize you, it attaches to the lumbar spine. So that's why a lot of times when people stand up, they feel really stiff and they feel pain in their back. It's because that hip muscle in the front is yanking on their lumbar spine, because it doesn't want to get longer now. You've been sitting way too long and it doesn't know how to get longer now. Allow the movement and control your stability. So this is a great way to test it. Can you do a nice step forward? Does that open up nicely? Even try bending back a little bit and see. I'm feeling that muscle is stretched a little, but you can see I got pretty good range here, right? And you want to make sure you've got it on both sides. So you're seeing, is there a difference? Is there something going on one side versus the other? Okay. The back of the hip. The back of the hip, a good way to test that's kind of easy and safe. You can hang on to a sink and have a chair behind you, make sure you're safe, is if I went to sit down, but I stepped back. So I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to sit, but I'm not going to sit. I'm going to pretend I'm going to sit. That's going to really test the strength and the stability of the back of my hip. So I just step back, I go to sit, and obviously that one's working fine. I'm going to check the other one. I'm going to step back and I'm going to sit. And just notice, is there a big difference? A lot of people, especially as we age, when they go to sit, right? What do? They plop because they've lost the ability to lengthen those muscles under control and sit with control. So, I mean, you want to be able to go all the way down and sit nice and smooth. I always used to joke when I was working in nursing home settings and rehab settings, I would say, be kind to your behind. Do not plop. But they needed the strength for that. And the really cool thing about the human body, there's a lot of really cool things about the human body. I love teaching about the human body. But one of the really cool things about it is it doesn't matter how old we are. We can always get stronger. I've had people 100 years old doing squats in parallel bars. I had a woman in her 80s who I gave her really strenuous exercises because the reason she was there is because she was cleaning the snow off her roof and she slipped off her ladder and got injured. She was going to go back home and she was still going to be doing all those things, climbing ladders and doing heavy work around her farm. She wasn't going to, be sitting in a chair knitting and drinking tea. This woman worked hard. So she needed to be able to train her body properly. But as I said, the cool thing is it doesn't matter how old we are. We can always get stronger. I had a gentleman, 86, who came to me. His wife was complaining because he had gotten so weak that she had to help him up out of the chair. And so he's sitting in the chair and he's looking at me and he goes, "Don't you think at my age I should be allowed to rest?" And I looked at him back and I said, "Well, if you want your wife to dust you off once a day." Well, he was a little shocked by my answer, but within 2 weeks, we had him leg pressing 200 pounds and he had no trouble getting up out of the chair. And his wife gave me a gift of a feather duster, which I thought was really cool. So back hip, this is how we're testing it, right? There's one side, there's the other. Have something to hold on to. So if you lose your balance, you don't get hurt. But if you can't sit without plopping, if you can't sit without pain, if you can't sit without something going on, you want to be able to train the back of that hip to restore that ability. All right, we got the outer hip. The outer hip, again, we're talking about the muscle getting longer under control, not getting shorter. If I want to just shorten this muscle, I can just swing my leg out and that muscle's doing the work and it's getting shorter. But I want to make sure it gets longer with control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cross a foot over and have my hip go like that. So now that outer hip is getting longer with control. If you put your hands on your hips, you're going to feel that hip coming up. And that muscle is controlling that motion so that I don't fall over. Okay? And of course, we would do both sides. So if you're feeling anything going on, your SI joints, the SI joints are where if you put your hands here, it's usually where the thumbs land. If you're a baby without a diaper on, it's the dimples, but that's the SI area. And you just notice, do you have any pain, any symptoms anywhere there, right? The inner hip, which would be the inner thigh as well, you're going to feel it there. The goal there is you're going to step out. But again, it's all weight bearing, right? So I'm going to step out. And how does that hip feel? Does it move away from my body in a way where I'm not feeling any pain or any issues? And of course, I'm going to do both sides. So it's about the hip moving out from the body, but in weight bearing, it's going to load the inner hip, right? So there's a couple of ways to train the hip. One of the easiest, because a lot of people have a lot of hip issues. So one of the easiest ways to do it is called a hip matrix. A matrix is anything that addresses all three planes of motion. So I love this one because it's a great warm up, and a lot of people who get stiff, when they get up in the morning, I know a lot of people who love this one for just loosening up their body, maybe before they take a walk or whatever. It's very simple to do. And again, if any of the movements create pain, you don't do the ones that hurt, you only do the ones that feel good. And so the first one is you're going to go forward and back. So I always just have your feet side by side, make sure your toes are forward so your feet aren't all kinds of weird. And hands on the hips gives you that nice manual cue. So your body is like, oh, we're going to work there. And all you're going to do is just come forward and back. And I'll show you side to side. So it's just take as small of a movement as you have to so that you don't feel pain, but you can go a little further if you've got good range and things can load well. But if you noticed that the front or the back of the hip weren't loading properly, this is a great way to get them to start loading properly without stressing and straining the body. One of the most important things to know when you have an issue you're trying to resolve is to not do exercises that create pain or that you feel really unstable or weak, because your brain is going to cheat, but it's not going to tell you it's cheating. And now what you're doing is you're training in dysfunction, not the way the body was designed authentically to move. So what we want to do is back up whatever it is we're training and find a way to train it with success, where we feel competent and confident doing it, because then we're going to build on that. So this is a great start for anybody who's got hip issues. You're just going to go forward and back. I'm loading the front of my hip. I'm loading the back of my hip. We've also got side to side. I'm going to load this side. I'm going to load this side. Very easy to do, right? And then we have rotation. And I realized I forgot to show you how to assess that first. So we rotate in and we rotate out. If I do it non-weight bearing, I pick this foot up, I can turn it in, I can turn it out. But it doesn't really matter if you can do that non-weight bearing. It matters if you can do it when I'm walking and living my life. I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking and I have to go from the refrigerator to the stove and I just rotated my hip. You need to have that, right? So what you're going to do is you'll just stand on here, hang on to something if you're worried about not being stable. And I'm just going to turn away from that hip, which is external rotation. And I'm going to turn in front of that hip, which is internal rotation. Now you can see I've got lots of motion in that hip. I don't have any issues at all, no pain, no problem. Some of the people watching this might only have a little bit of motion. They might only be able to turn just a little bit, right? So they want to be careful. And of course, you're going to test both sides. So when we do the hip matrix, you're going to rotate. We're going to do this. Now, when I turn to the right, this hip is turning out and this hip is turning in. When I turn left, it's the opposite. This one's going out, this one's going in. And I joke, it's kind of tongue in cheek. You can't train one hip. It's kind of like you don't have two hips, you really only got one. Because no matter what you do to one hip, something's going to happen to the other hip. You're always training both, no matter what you're doing. Even if you're laying on the bed, if you go to lift a leg, the other leg's pushing down. It's a physics thing. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. So you can't just train one hip. You're always training both. So the hip matrix is one of my favorite things to do. It's a beautiful way to kind of wake up and get all three planes moving. And then the last area, I'm not sure where we are for time. Are we okay for time?
We're great.
Okay. The last area that I want to address is trunk. And I want to make sure there's nothing I forgot for the hips. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I did want to show you how to load the front and the back of the hip because those tend to be the biggest areas. Of course, there's outside and inside, but I wanted to show you front and back. Now, we already did the hip matrix, which was nice and easy and simple, right? Now we're going to do something called, well, it's called opposite leg reach, but I call it toe tap because it's easier to remember. So what you're going to do is, if you want to load the front of the hip, and this starts to build really good stability for people who struggle to be stable, also for people who have pain, because this usually they can do successfully, and they're shocked at how this can move them forward and help to resolve things. So you'll hold on if you need to, especially if there's pain or if there's weakness. And you want to hold on to the opposite side of the leg that you're standing on. And this is where some people get confused. They think the leg that's moving is the leg that's exercising. It's the leg they're standing on that they're training. Okay. So if I want to train the front of my right hip, I'm going to tap my left foot forward. Now I don't need to hold on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap and come back. And as you can see, I'm sort of loading backward. So my whole body's involved. Remember, we talked about that. We want the whole body to be a team. If I was going to reach up and grab something on a shelf, my whole body would lean back, but that hip has to load in the front with control. right? Be stable and strong and lengthen under tension. So I'm just going to tap, and you do that repetitively. Now you don't want to toe dump where you're putting weight. You don't want to step into that leg. What we're doing is we're keeping all the weight on the one leg and just tapping, kind of like it's an eggshell and we don't want to break it. It's very, very gentle, right? And you'll notice you can really feel the front of that hip working. It's training in a very authentic way. We can also do the same thing for the back hip by tapping backward. Right? Now, there's other ways to add to this. There's a myriad of motions and movements you can do depending on your issues and your goals, but these are great beginner points. So you can tap backward, and when I tap backward, the leg that's not moving is the one that's working. So the back of my right hip right now is stabilizing me, and it's loading eccentrically to control my motion so that I don't fall. Obviously, I would hold on if I needed to, and we always do both sides. If you want a quick way to load the outside and the inside of the hip, you'll do the same thing with the tapping. You'll just tap. Just tap. This one always reminds me of Charlie Chaplin, which I know I'm showing my age, although I'm not that old. But you know, you kind of look like you need a cane and a top hat here. But you just want to tap the toe across the other foot, and you're going to load the outside of that. You want to feel that hip come up a little bit, because that means the outside of that hip is getting longer and it's loading. And then to load the inner hip is where you're going to tap outward. And so now the inside of my left hip is controlling that motion as I kind of lean into it and I tap with that other foot. So that's a great way to start training hips if you have any issues. It's very safe. You know, if you're bone on bone, that's a whole different story. And that's another conversation that has to be made. But if you're not that, these are generally pretty safe and a great way to get started getting those hips training properly. All right, the last area I want to talk about is the trunk, that thoracic spine between the neck and the low back. I already talked about how that can create pain and problems in other areas of the body, but now I want to show you how to assess it and then a couple of great training ways to do it. So a nice assessment is what's called a square stance matrix. And what you're going to do is you're going to kind of bend forward and kind of hunch your back a little bit, reaching down. And then you're going to come up and have your hips go forward as everything else goes backward. Now, a lot of people aren't aware that if your shoulder only comes so far, and let me raise my camera just a little bit so you can see this better. If your shoulder only goes so far here, it may not be your shoulder joint, it may be your trunk, your thoracic spine is not extending because, and you can try this, even if you're sitting in a chair, raise that arm up, but kind of stay slouched a little bit. The arm will only go so far. When you're up nice and straight and you feel that thoracic spine start to move back, you can get the rest of your shoulder motion all the way back behind your ear. So a lot of the times people are treating their shoulder when they don't have full flexion or they've got pain there. And unfortunately, there's, as I said, well-meaning but misinformed healthcare professionals who will lay somebody on a table and try to stretch them at the end range of flexion to get that shoulder motion back. But it's because their thoracic spine is not extending. And so now you're risking potential injury to that shoulder, right? So we want that thoracic spine to move. So assessing it would be kind of bending forward. That says flexion. Is it flexing nicely? And then up and back, do you get nice full shoulder motion? And is it extending properly? And then when we go to move sideways, if arms are up, we can go sideways. Now, this one isn't really about having your hips go side to side. This one is about, can you side bend? So this is kind of like doing the wave, you know, if you're at a game, right? Can you do a nice side bend right and left? That's your thoracic spine. And then the last one is rotation. So if you put your arms out in front of you, kind of like a Frankenstein position, right? And you're going to go all the way one way. Can you look behind you and point behind you? And all the way the other, and the same thing. So that's going to assess your thoracic spine, generally speaking, in a simple way, and then training it if you notice you've got some issues. So a lot of the times I like to have people kind of warm up and mobilize their trunk in sitting, because it kind of gets the pelvis and the hips out of the way. If the hips have an issue, now we've kind of removed them from the equation. So I'm going to show you this in sitting. So what you want to do is you want to be sitting toward the edge of your seat so that you're not going to be leaning on the back of the chair. And we want to mobilize the thoracic spine in all three planes of motion. So if you put your arms here, you kind of get them out of the way. You want to sort of slouch, which most of us are pretty good at, and kind of bring your elbows down toward where your hips meet your pelvis. And that's flexion. So that's that nice come forward, really slouch and round out that spine and mobilize it that way. Now, most of us are pretty good with that motion, but when you're coming out of it, you're starting to train it to go the opposite way. So this is still beneficial. Some of you might think, oh, I already slouch, I don't want to do that one. But I'm coming into the slouch, but now the muscles have to bring me out of the slouch. So it's still beneficial. And then the extension, and this is the one that you really want to pay attention to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get taller in the chair, and it's about bringing your ribs forward and up. And you can see now my head and shoulder kind of goes back. That's extension. So it's kind of like, you know, sort of being puffed up a little bit, right? I'm puffing myself up, and then I'm leaning my shoulders back, and that's going to be thoracic spine. If all you're doing is leaning back toward the chair, that's just your hips, right? You want your spine to be doing this. And this feels great, especially if you do a lot of work at a desk or sitting or computer work. This really feels good. And then, of course, we want to do side to side. So there's where we're going to get that beautiful side bending, kind of like you're bringing your shoulder toward the arms of the chair. And again, if you've got any kind of hips or pelvis or knee problems, this is a great way to work the spine without those being in the way. And then the last one is rotation. You want to rotate as far as you can. Ideally, you'll turn your head too, because your body tends to follow where your eyes go. That's why they say when you're driving, you shouldn't look off to the side of the road because there goes the car, right? So if we do this, we can get a nice, but if your neck hurts you, you can keep your head in neutral. And here's another quick little thing that I'll share. If your neck hurts, if you do these motions, but you keep your eyes fixed on something, you mobilize your neck from the bottom up. So if it hurts to turn your neck, but you can rotate your spine and keep your eyes fixed, guess what I just did? I just had my head go over my right shoulder. But because my neck muscles aren't doing it, I can do it without pain. And then very often, it'll restore your ability to turn your neck. I've had people who, even from just doing this one thing, have emailed me and said they couldn't believe how much better their neck felt because they mobilized their thoracic spine. So it's extremely, extremely helpful. So hopefully that hasn't confused too many people. It wasn't too much information all at once. And I'm guessing our time is kind of getting close to an end here.
No, it's okay if you go over. This is fascinating. And this is something we're going to have to watch. Well, at least I'm going to have to watch again because I've been watching the chat. But I was going to ask you at the beginning, like if you have any exercise videos, but this is basically it. You just did it. Yeah. Well, these are great starting points. I've got tons of content recorded for movements. I have a Move Without Pain private club where there's 52 workout, where I teach people the education behind basic truths and how the body moves. And then I teach them a specific workout. There's 52 of them. And then I've got lots and lots of content. And like I said, I just started doing movement education videos on my YouTube channel. I do a lot of shorts. They're called value videos that are like 3 or 4 minutes long. But I decided I would do ones that were longer, and specifically, like I just did ones on why your knee hurts when you walk. And I taught some things about the ankle and the hips. So cool. Moving on those. Yeah. It's a lot of fun. Before you started demonstrating, Carrie Lynn, who's watching live, said, can you show us a few good movements for lower back? But I would imagine everything you showed, I mean, the whole body is a unit. So yes. And that's a really good question. And you may have caught me saying that a lot of the times you can fix the low back by ignoring it and training the hips and training the thoracic spine. Because, and I'll go into just a little bit of detail on the lumbar spine. So the lumbar spine, it's designed because of how the vertebrae are oriented. And I've got
I've got Betty Bones over there that I could pick up and show, but I try not to get too detailed on something like this. But the lumbar spine, its job, its strength, its design, how the vertebrae land on each other, how they orient, allows it to be really good at bending forward and bending backward. That's its job. Now, if we have pain doing either one of those, it's because those muscles aren't loading to control the motion, right? So the front of the hips have to be loading, the back of the hips have to be loading. The lumbar spine is designed, it's not really good at side bending. It doesn't have a lot of side bending. So guess what happens? The hips have to be able to do that motion, right, in that frontal plane, and so does the thoracic spine, being able to do the wave. Then when you go to side bend, your lumbar spine doesn't get yanked because the other body's parts aren't doing their job. And with rotation, it's the same thing. The lumbar spine's not really good at rotating because of how the vertebrae join each other. So all that rotation, or most of it, is supposed to happen above in your thoracic spine and below in your hips. So training this area and this area can very often really help with low back pain, very much so. And it's really important to be training the whole body. Absolutely.
That is fantastic. Let me find another question. There's one from Apple. Could you please ask Eileen if infrared treatments, mats, and saunas are effective in pain management?
So that's kind of a double-edged sword question, because pain management it's an oxymoron, right? Nobody wants to manage their pain. They want to get rid of their pain.
Get rid of the pain.
Right?
Like get rid of your diabetes or get rid of your diabetes. Manage your obesity or yeah.
Yes. So now sometimes there are people who have gotten such a physical trauma, really serious accident, really serious injuries, where they've got things going on in their body that just can't be fixed, right? So you've got that population. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who had back surgery and then they literally get diagnosed with failed back surgery, which is an ICD-10 code, by the way. It's a diagnosis, failed back surgery. It's really scary. But and then they'll have a second, and then they're in horrible pain, and they have all this stuff. So I don't want to get off on a tangent, but pain management to me is, if there's nothing else that can be done. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there who don't know all the things that can be done, right? Like the 3-plane training that I just showed. So it's important to try these things, right? There's other methods that I use when I teach people virtually. There's other methods I use as well, which address the neurofascial system and rebalance symmetry side to side. There's a lot of things you can do. When it comes to modalities or procedures or treatments, a lot of the things that are done aren't really data-driven. They're more business-driven. They're more profit-driven. And I'm not saying that, doctors and people who want to help people are bad people. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there's a lot of things offered out there because they either don't know anything else to recommend or advise, and that's what they do, right? That, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everybody looks like a nail, right? So you're just going to keep recommending what you recommend. I've done a lot of research into a lot of the different things that are used to treat pain, and more often than not, and I don't have all the data up in front of me, so I don't want to answer details about the things this person asked, because I don't want to speak something that's off with a fact or a detail. But what I do know is the majority of time, the data doesn't support that it's very effective. And a lot of the times these things are pretty expensive. They're not even covered by insurance. So I think it's always better to train the body to restore function versus treating a symptom. And hopefully that didn't just frustrate them and the answer helped.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. And Susan has a question. And thank you, Susan, for the wonderful birthday gift you sent me. It's beautiful. She says, is it possible to avoid knee replacement with exercise? My husband has terrible knee pain. Maybe he should book a private consultation with you before he goes under the knife.
Yeah. So joint replacements, they're huge. They're done. They used to be done when somebody was like practically wheelchair bound and they couldn't function. Now they're done. I've had people come in post-surgical replacement And they tell me they weren't even using a cane to walk and they could go up and down stairs without pain. And I'm like, well, then why did you get the joint replaced? Oh, because they told me it was bad and it needed, and I'm like, really? So there's a, what's the way to put it? There are joints that are bone on bone. I mean, you've got this cartilage that covers the bone, and the cartilage doesn't really have any nerve endings. So it doesn't elicit pain. There's meant to be this fluid in the joint, synovial fluid, and that fluid is what's meant to keep those joints from banging into each other. It's meant to keep them, frictionless and gliding and smooth, and nothing's hitting each other. Well, you can have the mechanics off on the joint, where one side of the joint, because of how the muscles are working, is lost. There's less space. There's less fluid there. So now the cartilage starts rubbing, but there's no pain until the cartilage is completely gone. And then the bone, which has a lot of nerve endings, once the bone is hitting bone, that's where you get a lot of pain. Now, if the person is not bone on bone, a lot of the times the pain has nothing to do with their knee function, and it has everything to do with the hip function and the ankle function. And I have had people who, when they train those body parts, their knee pain resolves or dramatically improves. And then there's also the whole nutrition piece. I never want to forget about the food component, because that's massive. I've had people who stopped having joint pain because they went to a whole food plant-based diet. They eliminated dairy. That's the biggest offending factor when it comes to joint pain, as well as impaired circulation with all the oils. So what you do, AJ, is you're helping the whole world, because people don't realize just how impactful food is when it comes to pain. So
everything, aging well, feeling good. It's like, it's just amazing. Sherry says, how can we find your videos? Do you have a YouTube channel? Is that where they're at?
I do have a YouTube channel. Majority of it on there were things that I was just announcing for the different content that I provide for people who are members in my club and stuff. But I have started putting more education videos on there. And it's Have Lifelong Wellbeing is the name of the channel.
I'm gonna find that, and I'm gonna link to it in the show notes in just a second. But I saw another question about sciatica from Melanie. Have you found that any of the things you demonstrated today can help with sciatica?
Sciatica is a literal pain in the butt, and, right? And there can be different causes. It can be because there's something happening at the spinal level, and it's actually pressing on a nerve root. But what I found the majority of the time, it's because the piriformis muscle, which is a really deep muscle in the buttock, it sits right next to the sciatic nerve. So if that muscle's in spasm, when a muscle has spasm, it sort of creates, when it's yanked on because something's not aligned properly, it creates this tug of war. It's like a low-level tug of war. So, the muscle's getting pulled on one end and the muscle pulls back on the other end and says, stop yanking on me. So when that piriformis goes into spasm, I think it's about 87% of the population, the sciatic nerve is right under that muscle or through that muscle. So when that muscle's in spasm, it'll literally aggravate the sciatic nerve, and now you get the sciatic pain. So what I've found, and it's different for every person, when I see people physically in the clinic, I'm looking at the sacrum and I'm making sure they don't have a torsion. But what I recommend to these people is seek out a practitioner who's very well trained in muscle energy technique and strain and counter strain. And in my book, I talk about that. I've got a whole chapter on resources and how to find people who are skilled in doing things that actually work to resolve problems. I've also got a website for my book, painculprits.com, where I've got all the resources on there. I shouldn't say this, but people don't even have to buy the book to access the resources. But I just wanted to help people because the book would have been 400 pages. And so I put a lot of the resources on the website. But there's that. Now, also, what I found with people is training in the three-plane function. If you're not aggravating the nerve when you're doing the motions, what happens is when you move repetitively, you sort of create this fluid fill effect, this pumping mechanism that gets the muscles to start performing the way they were designed to. And very often it can alleviate that pain. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Here's a question from Chedarbug. Cute name. Any ideas on an Achilles tendon that healed long and after 1 year still cannot push up on its own?
Okay. So Achilles tendon, depending on whether it was a full rupture or a partial tear, I don't know the details, and I'm certainly not asking the person for them because I'm not going to diagnose somebody on video. That would be really irresponsible of me. But to just talk about basically what can happen with Achilles tendon, that Achilles tendon, as I showed, foot and ankle function is really important. And the Achilles tendon, for people who don't know, is that tendon, you can see my foot here, that comes down around right above the heel, right? That's your Achilles tendon. And it comes up into the calf muscle and goes down into the heel. That Achilles tendon has to load properly in order for that person to have good weight-bearing dorsiflexion, which you learned all about today. And so ideally, if it's healed and there's no ongoing injury, it might be that the fascia around it is kind of not happy. There's a lot of really good work you can do to address your own fascia. And that's where I recommend the melt method. The melt method, you use a very specially designed roller. It's really, really soft. It really curls nicely. You're not ironing your body like a shirt on a hard foam roller, and it's a small diameter. This does a beautiful way to release the calf muscles, the back thigh, that whole back line of the body, which is impacted when you've got a problem with the Achilles. There's also a hand and foot ball kit, which there's balls in here. They're all different sizes and dimension and density. So there's a really soft, squishy one. There's a really firm one. And then there's a couple of smaller ones that are soft and firm. And you do very specific techniques to the feet, which treats the fascial line. And when you do that, it literally lengthens, it decompresses, it hydrates. So that might be something that would help this person as well.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we asked the sciatica question. Oh, here's one from Debbie. Will these exercises strengthen as they lengthen, or are there other exercises we should do for strength?
Oh, really good question. So yes, when you are lengthening a muscle, you are triggering it to get stronger because it has to be able to contract under load and then unload. So it is a way to strengthen the body. Now, and I'm in my 60s and I've got full 3-plane motion. And last summer I dug a fire pit. We have this grass, this zoysia grass that's so thick and heavy, it literally took me hours with a pick. And I was okay. I didn't hurt myself, right? So the strength is there. I always recommend that people do a lot of really basic work to make sure that back butt, that back hip has a really good power source, because a lot of the times, if you struggle to push open a door, it's not because your arm is weak, it's because your power source is weak. Because when you go to push open a door, that physics thing, that equal and opposite movement that has to occur, you're actually pushing through the floor with your foot, which is counting on the power source to provide the ability to push that door open. So when it comes to strength, you do want to be doing movements that elicit strengthening. But the 3-plane training is a beautiful way to do that. You can do it with weights, body weight. You could do squats with your feet in like 27 different positions. There's stepping forward, stepping back, going narrow and wide, and toes in and toes out. All these ways to really train those muscles. I've got some training videos in the private club where I think one of them I did 400 lunges or something in about 20 minutes. But it was a way where it trained all the muscles. So trust me, yeah, you can really build strength this way. It just depends on how fit you are to start with.
Right. You are just like an encyclopedia of this stuff. What is your practice? And if people live near you, could they come see you in person? Because TS is saying, do you do virtual assessment? And you said you did, but sometimes.
Yes. I transitioned to virtual when the world shut down, and I've kind of stayed there because I love it. There's no fear of anyone catching anything or putting themselves at risk. And there's also this way where I can spend as long as I want to with people, as long as I need to. When you're in a clinic setting, the insurance reimbursement is minimal, so time is limited, right? Now, I do want to share this real quick. I won't take long. If you go to a clinic where your therapist is seeing 4 people an hour, and you're kind of doing everything on your own, and they're just sort of overseeing you, if they're even looking at you, you don't want to go there. Get out of there. That's a place that's trying to make more money because of the poor reimbursement, and the patient is the one who suffers, right? You want to go someplace where you get one-on-one care, ideally a full hour for an evaluation and 30 minutes for a follow-up visit. That's what you want. You need to find places that do that. Don't go to the shake and bake and, herd them in, herd them out kind of places. They're not going to help you. Those are the places where people say, I tried physical therapy, it didn't work. That wasn't physical therapy. That was a ripoff. You don't want to go to those places. But what I found is, I spend like an hour and a half when I do an initial consultation, sometimes up to 2 hours. So I love that I can spend that kind of time with people, and follow-up sessions are a full hour. And boy, can we accomplish a lot in that period of time. So I prefer it to the clinic setting.
I know some physical therapy places are they're kind of like auto body chop shops, like it's like the fast food version. But man, a good physical therapist, there's nothing like one. I got to tell you, I'm in love with mine. I mean, I'm not in there, but I mean, like I went in, it was just, I have this thing, and I don't know what it's called, but I got this bump on my foot. It's like tendonitis. I got a bump on my foot, right? And I went to the podiatrist, and so he ordered some physical therapy. And I was still having pain. And then he said, because I told him I spin every day. He goes, can you take a video of you spinning? And my husband did. And he said, the problem isn't your foot, it's your hip. And it was like, oh my God, like where, and so now instead of treating the pain, we're still treating the pain in the foot. He has me taped, but now he's figuring out the weakness in the hip. And it's like, I mean, a good physical therapist is like, it's gold. I mean, it's gold, right?
You found a good one. And every profession has a bell curve, right? So you got those who shouldn't be doing it, and then you got the middle of the road, and then you got the ones who are really skilled and experienced and knowledgeable. It's every profession has that.
Nice. April says she may have joined late. And have you talked about piriformis syndrome?
Well, that's the sciatic. That's when I talked about the piriformis muscle, how it can go into spasm. And what can happen is that sacrum, which is that upside down triangle at the bottom of your spine, with the point being your tailbone, that can end up a little bit torqued, a little bit off. And when it does that, because the piriformis attaches to the sacrum, it ends up kind of pulling on it. And that's where you get the spasm, and the piriformis isn't happy. So you kind of want to improve the mechanics of the sacrum. And there are multiple ways to do that. Manual work is one way, finding somebody skilled. And that, that resources, that's in my book, and it's also on the website. And then there's the melt method, there's the 3-plane training. So there's a lot of ways to address it depending on, because each person is like a fingerprint. Everybody is so unique. We've all got our own history of any potential trauma and injury and harm, and how our emotions react to the world, and how we manage and navigate the world, and then what we've done for a living or our recreation. And so everybody's like a fingerprint. And so everybody needs sort of a different approach based on how much you're going to focus on one approach versus another approach. So that, but just trying these things, a lot of them are very inexpensive or free, and you can kind of seek out what resonates with you.
Great. And Rebecca says, have you talked about TMJ therapy? I've had 4 sessions and not better yet. That's how I met the good physical therapist, because I had to wait for months, because even though you may learn it in school, there was literally in the entire Coachella Valley, which is huge, only 2 physical therapists that were able to treat TMJ.
Yeah, TMJ is a tough one. And a lot of people don't realize this. This is kind of going back to the history. TMJ was not paid for by insurance if you went to a PT. So that's why a lot of PTs didn't learn how to treat it, because it wasn't covered by insurance. They considered it a dental problem. But of course, a dentist isn't going to treat the muscles and the joints the way a PT is trained to treat, right? So a lot of that is why it's hard to find PTs who treat TMJ. I'm thinking the reimbursement has changed now, so it is covered by insurance.
No, it is, and it's unbelievable. Like, I don't know, he just touched me. I mean, this guy's like a Svengali, like he just kind of, and he wasn't even like doing anything. And I'm thinking, I got to tell you this, but I wish Ken would watch this. I'm thinking to myself, this is BS. Like he's barely touching me. And he's, I'm like, this is just like mamby-pamby, like when you get a massage and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I don't know how he does it or how he knows, but he would take measurements. I mean, this guy's the real deal. Let me tell you, like you,
Yeah.
I know that when you're the guest, you can't see the comments, but I hope you'll go back and look at them because they're comments like from Sheila. Thank you. This is a brilliant interview. Jesse says, Eileen has given us more complete, in-depth information here in a little over an hour than I have gotten after multiple medical center physical therapy sessions. Really wonderful. So we do appreciate everything.
Thank you. I just got chills. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I think the reason I'm here on the planet and the reason I breathe is because I'm meant to help people get out of pain. So,
well, and when you think about it, most medical visits are because of that, for any kind of doctor, at least a great majority of them, I would think.
Yeah. Well, the data actually says that 7 out of 10 medical visits have to do with pain.
Yeah. So
the other 3 have to do with prescription updates, post-surgical follow-up, or a checkup. The other 7 are all to do with pain.
That's incredible. And I would think so much in the orthopedic realm, especially because there's like so many joints and bones and muscles. There's a lot to go wrong in the body.
Yeah. But unfortunately, the orthopedic world, their training is surgical or injections. And so, that they're not going to teach you how to restore 3-plane function in your hips.
Right. Well, that's why I had a physiatrist on the show this week, completely plant-based, Dr. Lily Rosenthal, and she's like in the same mind of you. No, we get to the root cause. We don't just, like people would say, but my MRI shows this. And she's like, well, you're not your MRI,
Right. Yeah. And I tell people, I don't mind knowing what their imaging says, but a lot of the times, and I talked about imaging and how it's not all that accurate, right? And the last time I was here with you, but, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the reason you got your problem, right? That guy with the neck that I fixed by mobbing his ankles, if he'd have got an MRI, they probably would have found something, but it had nothing to do with the neck, right? So I realized you didn't answer her TMJ question. So I don't want the poor woman to be frustrated. So it is a joint, right? Temporomandibular joint. And obviously it's affected when you open your mouth for people who aren't realizing. And as you said, AJ, he measured you, right? So how far could you open your mouth, right? How much space between your teeth, that kind of thing. That joint has a disc in it, which a lot of people don't realize. And a lot of the times the pain is because the joint is off mechanically and the disc is not timing properly. And so that's why you'll get that little pop that happens because the disc now is catching up as you open the mouth, or it's so painful you can't open the mouth. There's a lot that can be done, as you said. Your PT was very skilled in addressing your TMJ. What I found too is sometimes it's other parts of the body. If your shoulders are kind of up here because you're always stressed out, that upper trap goes right up into that joint. And so if that upper trap is pulling, it's going to pull that out of alignment, right? You can even have something going on with the low back and the lat dorsi, which is that great big muscle that goes from the low back right up the side. When the guy bodybuilders do this and they kind of look like a cobra, that's the lat dorsi, right? The muscle here. And that comes up and attaches to the front of the shoulder, which it can pull down, which can pull on the upper trap, which can pull on the TMJ. So you kind of want to look at the person as a whole body. And then there's also a lot of things too. If people are under a great deal of stress, emotional and otherwise, and of course the whole world's under a lot of stress right now, right? So we're tensing all our muscles and we're just kind of in this protective mode. And that can create a lot of imbalance in the body, the TMJ being one of them. So
it reminds me of that song, the hip bone's connected to, everything really is connected. So here's a question from Jackie. What is the best relief for pain from strength training besides stretching and yoga? Any advice for torn chest muscle?
Ooh, torn chest muscle. Ouch. So strength training, as you heard me say earlier, a lot of the times we're shortening a muscle. We're not lengthening it with control. So we're creating inflammation and potential harm and damage with repetitive motions. So it's not necessarily a good thing, right? And we're trying to isolate muscles. And if you're using machines, if you're using weights that are too heavy for you, if you're really struggling to move a weight because you want to get stronger and your body's getting really, really tense in order to move that weight, it's too heavy for you and you're potentially going to injure yourself, right? So, I can't really give you specific advice on how to deal with your issue. But I will say that when a muscle is injured, obviously it has to heal. There are ways to promote healing in the body. I highly recommend the melt method. It's a beautiful way to restore any injury or harm that we've done. It promotes the healing and repair response in the body. It also helps to address, like I tell people, you don't have hundreds of muscles, you have one muscle separated by hundreds of compartments of fascial tissue. So when you're addressing the fascial system, you're going to promote lots of really good things in the body. I mean, I could talk about that for hours, but I won't, I promise. So as far as recovering from strength training, what you want to do is you want to train properly, authentically, and stop doing the isolating, stop doing, motions that are not authentic, right? And here's one, I'll just do a real quick. How many people go to the gym and they put their foot in front of the thing and they push up against the weight, and they're building their hamstrings, right? Well, guess what? Is there any, and I'm sure, AJ, you can't even think of one. Is there any motion in life where we do that against resistance?
No, not really. No.
So it's a very inauthentic movement, and we're doing it repetitively against weight. So you're risking hurting yourself. It's the same thing when you sit in a chair and you're at the gym and you got the thing here and you're pushing up against the weight and you're pushing up against the weight. We don't do that either in real life. And that creates a lot of torsion on the knee. So there's a lot of things we do in the gyms or with training where we're literally harming ourselves and we're not even aware of it, right? And then over the years, we end up with some problem, rotator cuff tear or whatever, and we're like, oh, I'm getting older or whatever, but it's all of that really inauthentic training with the body. So it's important that when you're strength training, you're doing authentic movements. Even big ones like push-ups are really good strength training. And you can do it with your hands in different positions. Planks, you can do 3-plane motion in planks, which are very good. Squats and lunges, you can do all those in a way where you're not injuring your body. There's lots of ways you can do that. But I highly recommend the melt method for any kind of post-workout soreness or whatever, or even before you go to do a workout. And I highly recommend the 3-plane warm-up for anybody who's in a sport because it enhances their performance as well as the melt.
Great. Thank you. Well, maybe we have time for one more question from Anya. I had an ankle break. It's now healed, but I'm having issues with balance.
Yes. So the fracture itself may be healed. I had a fractured ankle myself from a car accident many years ago, but the motion may not be restored, right? You may be lacking dorsiflexion. You may be lacking plantar flexion. You may be lacking that inversion and eversion of the heel. That heel bone has to be able to turn out and in. So that's going to affect your balance because, as I said earlier, that heel bone has to invert for that subtalar joint to rotate up and out and create a nice stable foot. So if you're lacking balance, also, when you had the fracture, and again, this is not me diagnosing you, I'm just speaking generally, most people, when they injure an ankle, they're going to be non-weight bearing, they're going to be in a boot, they're going to be using crutches. So that whole hip complex can weaken. And that your hip may not be functioning properly because as the ankle was rehabbing and healing, the hip was hanging out doing nothing. So it's important to make sure you're addressing those big rock areas that I talked about earlier.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
I told you last time, one of the physical therapists, retired physical therapists in the plant-based movement wrote me to tell me how much she enjoyed your presentation. And I'm going to definitely send her this one.
That was wonderful. And I do want to just mention, I teach a 6-day Move Without Pain challenge about every couple of months. And I'm teaching one starting April 25th and it's free. So I fire hose people for 6 days in a row. And so anybody who's interested can join me. And I do record it for those who are too busy to be there live.
All right. Well, gosh, if I live near you for sure, and if I didn't already have Ken, but if I move and I lose Ken, you are going to be my go-to person.
You'd have a long trip. We're on opposite sides of the coast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eileen. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. We have 2 more amazing shows coming up in the next 24 hours. I hope you'll join me at 5 p.m. for my free Dinner with Chef AJ series. We're going to be making tonight the over the rainbow lettuce cups with sweet potato croutons and cherry cobbler with pear creme and glace. And then tomorrow at 11 a.m. we have Chef Julia Dunaway, who's going to be making what she says is the best veggie burger she's ever created. And she makes a lot of them, and she's going to be making it as a salad with a special sauce. Take care, Eileen.